Every year, global leaders, activists, and journalists gather under one roof to talk climate. It's called COP, short for the Conference of the Parties, the world's biggest climate summit under the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. Here, countries negotiate how to cut emissions, adapt to disasters, and finance recovery for nations already living through climate collapse. But while promises are big, the realities, especially for countries like Pakistan, are often complicated. Pakistan contributes less than 1% of global emissions, yet ranks among the 10 most climate vulnerable nations. So when our representatives show up at COP, the stakes are high. But how much influence do we really have? To unpack that, we spoke to Zaki Abbas, reporter for Dawn.
Okay, so COPs are annual UN climate talks. Like it happens every year. Basically, COP is an acronym, Conference of Parties, and by parties we mean countries. So they happen every year, hosted by the UN, where almost 180, 190 countries gather to negotiate on their climate goals, climate finance, and other things. So usually what happens is countries negotiate in blocks. Like there's a group for least developing countries, it's called LDCs. There's a group for countries like Pakistan, which are developing countries, basically two groups. LMDCs, like-minded developing countries. I know there are a lot of acronyms at COPs, so it's difficult to follow through. And then there is G77 plus China. So Pakistan is usually like mostly a part of this group, G77 plus China. And in as a part of this group, it negotiates at COP. So what role Pakistan can play? At COP27, Pakistan was the chair of G77, and Pakistan played an instrumental role in the operationalization of loss and damage fund.
From technical jargon to last minute drafts, COP can feel like a conference of contradictions. Big talk, slow action.
Okay, so COPs do play a role in helping countries meet their climate goals. I know when we talk about COPs, usually the argument is okay, they're not fit for purpose, like the money agreed at COP isn't coming in. But there have been some good initiatives as well. Like all the money Pakistan has got in climate change, I think they've got according to 2021 in documents, they got like $4 billion in climate finance. Um, and and then there was at the recent COP in Baku, Pakistan got 77 million for recharge in Pakistan initiative. So COPs do help vulnerable countries in getting some money, but it isn't enough. And even if there is progress, it takes a long time to materialize. For instance, I mentioned the loss and damage fund, and then there was a Paris Agreement. It was signed in 2015, but the money that was promised in the Paris Agreement, that was like 100 billion per year from developed countries to developing countries, it didn't materialize till 2024. So like it's a give and take. Usually developing countries, they are coming back empty handed, but still there is hope, and they go every year to COP to build their case for climate finance. And
Every year ends with pledges, yet for many in Pakistan, the floods return. The droughts deepen, and the aid rarely reaches those who need it the most. While global leaders debate emissions targets, those who protect the planet every day, farmers, fishermen, and indigenous communities, are often missing from the room.
so at the official level, they're not really seen at the negotiating table or at climate forums. But civil society, it has a strong indigenous groups presence, and they do make their presence felt at every COP. If if somebody who has been to COP, they can see indigenous communities, they'll be leading protests, they will be pressurizing the governments to act, to negotiate on their behalf. But usually, at recent COP29, there was this decision about carbon markets. like carbon market under Article 6 of Paris Agreement. So carbon markets, they are controversial in an aspect because they promise climate action at the expense of indigenous communities. And indigenous communities at protests, they also complain that they are not really part of the negotiation process. But at this conference in Belém, there are about 3,000 delegates who will be from indigenous communities. There are still complaints that they have not been given enough representation and they want to have uh, and they want to be at COPs and which actually deliver something to them. But there is this program that is being pitched by Brazil. It's about reforestation, and I think 20% proceeds of that project they have been allocated to the indigenous communities. But if this materializes into something, that is yet to be seen.
In Pakistan, communities in Sindh, Balochistan, and the northern valleys live closest to the crisis but are furthest from the negotiations meant to protect them.
Pakistan is a curious case. Like we go to COP and we say we are a vulnerable nation. We are like one of the most affected nations. But at home, at home, the people who are most vulnerable to the impact of climate change, they are not really made part of the like dialogue, talks, or any of the decision making. So Pakistan's delegation, it doesn't really have diverse representation. Usually, there are people from government, there are people from some civil society organization, and there are some consultant experts um, like people from Thar, people from Gilgit Baltistan, people from like Chitral, and they're not really seen at Pakistan's pavilion in COP. I'll give you an example. Um, climate change, one of the biggest sources of climate change is fossil fuels. And Pakistan is currently expanding its coal footprint by expanding coal thermines. Um, but if you go to the local communities, they are the victim of this coal-led development. But Pakistan hasn't really cared for these people, and all the development that is promised, using local coal as a vehicle, it ignores these people. So indigenous communities, local groups, vulnerable groups, I think the system that we currently have, which is consumption led, it doesn't really work for climate, it doesn't really work for local communities or indigenous communities.
If climate diplomacy doesn't include those facing the crisis firsthand, can it ever be just?
Okay, so 2 points to this. One is climate diplomacy and one is NDCs. Again, we are back to acronyms. So NDCs is like nationally determined contributions, like climate goals that countries decide. So, climate diplomacy at recent COP, Pakistan pitched a case for South Asian diplomacy to combat climate change. Because by South Asian diplomacy, we mean that most of the South Asian states they share glaciers and mountain ranges. So, and like according to like recent studies, like by 2050, I think like most of the glaciers they'll be gone. So unless regional states they come together, I think this organization ICMOD. It's working on like glaciers and projects in Nepal, Bangladesh, and Pakistan is also working with them. I'm not really sure, but so this is one thing Pakistan can use SARC as a forum to build an effective case for climate diplomacy. I know SARC is dead, but it can be revived or some other regional group can be used. Um, but there are also developing countries, they are not really happy with the COP process. So recently, I met a climate minister from at least developing countries, and they said to me like we should boycott COP. Like by boycotting mean they didn't mean boycott COP as a process, but they said we should boycott at least one COP so that developed countries, they can be pressurized into meeting their commitments. So diplomacy, I don't really know how it's going to work, but Pakistan really needs to tap regional forums for effective climate action. But when we and about nationally determined contributions are Pakistan's climate goals. Like I've been covering climate for at least four years now. Like it's really hard to like get information what government is planning to do. So if we are talking about an inclusive process, if we are talking about something that affects all of us, so why keep this under wraps? Why gather some groups, some government departments, some civil society groups, some scientists like government scientists, and come up with climate goals, which which are going to decide the fate of like 20, 25 to 50 million people. So when I was working on stories on NDCs, I would go to government officials, I would go to civil society, and most of them were like, we cannot share details. Like, it's not a secret document, it's not a sensitive document that you have to keep this under wraps, you have to keep the contents hidden. So either it's really a secret document or the government really doesn't want to be transparent with data. Because if they are transparent about data, then they'll be held accountable. And I think when it comes to climate change or any other thing, the government does not want to show figures, the government does not want to show data, the government does not want to do the money it has gotten in climate finance, where it has gone, or the policies it is making, whether they are actually helping whether they are actually helping tackling climate change, or they are really intensifying the impacts of climate change. Because when we say that we are among the least contributors, like 1% figure, so there's also this number fudging. We are 1%. Our historical emissions, they have also been negligible, but still we are the 28th largest emitter. And when it comes to methane, which is really a potent gas that really warms the planet up, Pakistan is among the top 10 methane emitters. So we cannot just get away with saying we haven't done much harm to climate and we need money to fix our climate problems. But unless our governance, our local policies, they are aligned to actually combat the harms of climate change, nothing can be done, I think.
The gap between the negotiating halls and the floodplains remains wide, and bridging it is perhaps Pakistan's biggest climate challenge. Climate change doesn't impact everyone equally, and women, especially in developing countries, are paying the highest price. Yet, at summits like COP, their voices are often an afterthought. We spoke to Afia Salam, a veteran climate journalist and activist, about how visible women from countries like Pakistan truly are on the global stage. Hello, Afia ma'am. How are you? Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So, COP30 has just kicked off, but an important question that remains is that how visible are women voices from countries like Pakistan in global climate negotiations like COP?
So the visibility has been growing, but it's not at the level that it should have been. And it's strange when if you look at numbers, they tell a different story. But if you look at the places where there have been, the positions that those women who are there hold, that tells another story. Because don't forget that IPCC has been led by a woman for years. So we have that. Then many of the delegations, including Pakistan's, in just 3-4 years ago, was also led by a woman minister. So we had a woman who was in charge of, working on the climate finance. There was another one who was doing the climate credits. There are these different streams at the COP. Those were led by women. So if we look at it in that context, yes, it has. They are important. They contain those important decision-making places. But when where the buck stops is the political leadership of every country, and that's what people actually look at. The optics are important. The number of women at these forums, just to see them milling around, it's important to see as many women as there are men. And I have attended just two, but within a space of 6 to 8 years, and I have seen a visible change. And the people who have been going there regularly for many years, they can actually comment, and they tell me there are a lot more now than there were before, and they are getting a lot younger, which is very encouraging, very refreshing. So you see these spaces and you see the hope, otherwise they wouldn't be there.
As you rightfully said that the visibility is increasing, because I myself also see a change, and I think so many incredible women and so many incredible women-led startups are now representing Pakistan at COP as well. So now I want to delve into the part that, do you think that the promises that are made at COP, they ever translate into real change for women who are living through the climate disasters, especially in countries like Pakistan?
I have a friend here in Pakistan who's been to COPs, who's followed this process, and he calls it, each year he's been calling out that number, the 26 years of failure, 29 years of failure. And I hope he doesn't have to say 30 years of failure. Because if you look at the bottom line is that we need emissions cut, because that has been, the science over there is settled that is the cause of climate change. I mean, the other factors are there, obviously, but that is the main thing. What are we talking about? Greenhouse gases. That's the global warming, and that is what is triggering climate change. So we haven't been successful, have we? It's been like a one step forward, two step backwards. There are treaties and there are protocols and there are high sounding promises. And then we see the countries causing the problem, walking away from those promises and actually burdening the countries which are not responsible with meeting the commitments, which would keep them stuck in that underdeveloped bracket. Which I find it to be not just unfair, I find it infuriating that they become so preachy and they want all the other countries to cut emissions and step up and sign this and meet these targets. But look at the world where it's headed, and because of whom it is headed in that direction.
Absolutely. And I think climate change is something that has become our reality now, and especially in countries like Pakistan. And I think more than COP, I think our provincial policies and our federal policy have to come to a level where they take care of people, and especially women and children, who actually bear the brunt of the disaster. We also, talk a lot about inclusion, but on the ground, why do you think that women who are from indigenous and rural backgrounds, who've actually protected natural resources, why do you think they still remain absent from major climate negotiations like COP?
So maybe we haven't. Well, there are many forums. Yes, you're right. It isn't just the COP. There are several COPs that happen. There are CBD COPs. There are other COPs. And yes, I know this COP is that big party that everybody wants to be at, see and be seen kind of a place. But the point is that you may not have seen this in Pakistan yet, that the indigenous population representation is there. But we have seen an increase, and we have those examples from South America, from Africa, very strident voices from the small island nations. And within Southeast Asia, South Asia, you see the Bangladeshi contingent is always, about, three figures, 200 people, 300 people, even more. And you see a lot of inclusion there, or I keep quoting Bangladesh, because they, within the past 2-3 decades, have shown that things can change more than any other country within our regions. Because, there are other countries, but I'd like to sort of quote apples to apples examples. So we can relate to what they were like, because they were us, and things were not good for them. But they turned themselves around in this. There are other issues, but in most of the issues, when they brought in inclusion, and this is the important point, I feel the successes they have had in adaptation, in becoming climate proof, has a backstory, and that backstory is the inclusion of women in in education, in economic empowerment, which was done through strategic and across the board interventions, which were not stopped, which were not hostage to who was ruling the country. That was seen as a nation's agenda. It wasn't a party agenda. If this party is in power, they will do it, and if that party is in power, no, this was their country agenda. I think that is a roadmap that we should actually look at for ourselves, because we are number one threatened country. How do we look away from that? And that
Absolutely.
means half our population is more vulnerable than the other half.
Absolutely.
Women, children, the infirm, the elderly, and if you put a umbrella of poverty, all the poor. So we are very segmented society, and there's a whole segment of our society which is more impacted than others.
Absolutely. For Pakistan, the fight for climate justice isn't just about emissions, it's about inclusion. The people who lose homes, crops, and livelihoods must gain a voice in shaping recovery. You also mentioned the loss and damage fund. Absolutely, it took almost 30 years for the fund to be operationalized, and yet it's still not operational. And every year, different sorts of funds are promised at COP. So, who do you think actually ensures that those loss and damage funds will reach women who are trying to rebuild their lives because of floods or droughts? Not just loss and damage, but the other funds, that are promised as well.
So why I am sounding, I don't know if I'm sounding cynical. I just try to keep myself from being sounding bitter. Is that this is not the only fund. We've had earlier promises which were never delivered on. The 100 billion never reached beyond 60 billion, and that was supposed to be a yearly fund. So, we've had adaptation fund, we have the green climate fund. Okay, that's project based. So yes, countries need to pitch for projects to be able to access funding. Pakistan has accessed some funding through some very good projects through the GCF. But the earlier funds, the climate fund that was promised past, I think, from after Copenhagen, which was COP15, to now we are 15 years down the road, several funds were created, but never, completed. Never the ceiling was reached. So whether loss and damage will do the same thing or not, loss and damage, why it is different from them is because it has made the polluters or the emitters accept responsibility. Otherwise, those are very sanitized words. There's green climate fund, there's adaptation fund. It doesn't assign responsibility to any sector. But when you say loss and damage, then somebody has, has suffered a loss and damage because of someone else. It's implicit in those two words, loss and damage. So when we know who they are, that means the fact that it has entered the text means they know that somebody is responsible and somebody needs to step up to make good the loss and damage who are, communities or nations which are being impacted because of their actions. So that owning of that responsibility may be very intangible, may be very, something you can't really say, oh, here I'm holding a trophy in my hand. Here it is. No. But the fact that it enters this text as loss and damage means that there are nations who have owned up to the damage they have done. But beyond that, we need to, I can't predict, I don't have a crystal ball to say that this will work better than the other funds. It should. It's a moral imperative. And this is why you can see that the conversation around climate change has shifted from calling it climate change, then we called it a climate crisis. And then what was the resonance for, across the world, especially from the youth? They're demanding climate justice. Right? They are not talking about adaptation or mitigation. There should be climate justice. And justice can only happen if those who are causing climate change stop doing what is causing it and help those whom they have damaged. So now the actual rallying cry across societies is for justice, equity, justice, fairness. That.
Absolutely. So to wrap up the conversation, you just spoke about climate justice as well. So if climate justice was shaped through women's experiences, from indigenous farmers to kin and factory workers, what do you think it would look like?
Well, climate justice, in my view, would actually have to start only with inclusion. You have to have women at the table. You have to have their voices. We still, to this day, even today, I called out a manel. I said, you're talking about fair play and justice and equity and all these fancy words. Why are men talking about it? I'm not saying don't have men talk about it, but women's voices, we have to move beyond tokenism. So if women are included, they say they don't know much about it or they don't come. Now that is a valid reason. They don't come because it's a historical baggage of women not being made to feel welcome or made to feel as if they are adding value to the conversation. And many times they generally don't know as much as the men because historically men have been in those positions that they get to know about these things. They've been calling the shots. So it will take a while. I'm not saying about the gender parity, which says it will take us 250 years or 70 years to reach that. No, it has to start right now. Get the women there, allow them to first listen and, get their knowledge base up and then listen to their opinion. If they say something which doesn't make sense to you, you don't have to brush them, away, and don't have to be dismissive of them. You hold a conversation, sit across the table. So that is until that starts happening, and we have seen wherever it has happened, there has been positive change. There was a time just a few years ago when the largest economic and political bloc was led by Angela Merkel, the most powerful woman, I would say. Right on the other side of the world, okay, maybe for empathy, but for efficiency, Jacinta Ardern. You see these women in Denmark and Finland, 3-member, 4-member government, the prime minister as well as 3-4 ministers are running the whole country. Okay, they are small countries. But irrespective, they also have reached and breached many glass ceilings to reach there. So people have to make way. And in Pakistan, we have women who, who really made a name in the field of economics, in the field of climate, in the field of climate science, in the water science, climate justice, politics. Hello, we are a country who had a woman prime minister twice. So this is what I meant, that, when you count numbers, you feel, no, there's no progress. You see men everywhere. But when you see the women sitting in those places, that means the women have been powerful enough in powerful positions to be able to call the shots. That's only because they were given that space, or they snatched that space and never gave it back. So it works both ways. If men understand that they will be more strengthened and not feel threatened by the presence of women, then it will show value. It will show value. They should just look around them and see how other countries are going ahead with it. I mean, you've got such great successes in Africa. Look at Rwanda. Right? So I never tire of quoting such examples because the world is littered and we must take off our blinkers and understand that women have the capacity. They have the knowledge. They have the strength to, be there in the argument and not be browbeaten. We've had those women, and we have those women even now. So that inclusion is important. And these are the women who are also making way for the indigenous women. They take them along. They sit with them. They give them the chances, and more need to do that. Much more needs to be done to include the voices which don't reach the highest echelons.
It would look like shared leadership. It would sound like community voices, not just official statements. And it would mean that COP outcomes don't just sit in policy documents, they show up in people's lives. You're watching Front Seat to Climate Change on DawnNews TV. Catch the full conversations with Afia Salam and Zaki Abbas on DawnNews English. I'm Mahin Azam Khan signing off. Until next week, let's keep asking, whose voices are missing and what will it take to bring them to the front seat of climate change?